What are your thoughts on the new OBX8? Some days it's very tempting. Other days I'm more grounded in reality and realize I probably don't need to spend $5,000 on another synthesizer. I was talking to Chipmunk Jones about new analog versus old analog and how some of the marketing practices of these newer analog polysynths can be a bit deceptive. And by deceptive, I mean that it's being marketed in a way that makes the synth consumer think that they're getting a 1978 Prophet 5 or a 1979, 1980 OBX, OBX8, whatever. And yes, we have shifted to surface mount technology, which in and of itself does the exact same thing that through-hole technology components do. But because they're more consistent, they have more stable temperature coefficients, okay? Then because they're more stable, more reliable, they have a more clinical, brittle sound. That's sort of the argument, right? And that's not completely incorrect, but also I don't think that's completely accurate either. The majority of the folks who have owned vintage Prophets that I know usually give the same ballpark figure between 90-95% close to the original. So there's an interview with Trevor Horn, the producer of Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Art of Noise. He's considered the man who invented the 80s. And I remember something he said in an interview that younger producers in their bedrooms are trying to achieve these 80s sounds and in their productions and never will because modern technology lacks the bandwidth to create those fat 80s sounds. This also goes back to an argument I had with a professor when I was studying electrical engineering about how digital to analog converters ultimately attenuate the signal, attenuate the sine wave. And he argued with me that wasn't the case and that it was an exact replica of a sine wave. And maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong, but I have to agree with Chipmunk Jones about newer analog synthesizers. They're not going to achieve the same exact breadth and depth as a vintage analog synthesizer. They're just not. But to me, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is completely subjective. In fact, I love my Prophet 10 even more now in 2022 than I did when I first got it. When I first started playing it, it did make me think of nostalgic moments in the 80s. But keep in mind, I never had an original Prophet 5. I've never played an original Prophet 5 myself. And going by comparisons on YouTube, I can only hear a very minimal difference between the two. Negligible to me. But that might not be the case for somebody who grew up playing vintage synthesizers. All right, somebody who grew up in the 70s and had an ARP 2600 and had a Prophet 5 Rev 3.3 or whatever. So I'm going to make a comparison today between one of my favorite vintage polyphonic analog synthesizers. In fact, the only one that I can make a comparison with, the Roland JX3P. The Roland JX3P is a synthesizer that I have compared all other polyphonic synthesizers to because there's a certain magic to it. Okay, there's a certain beauty. And yeah, it's digitally controlled oscillators. It's not even voltage controlled oscillators, but it has the voltage controlled filter and the voltage controlled amplifier. So there's a few patches I've made that I still have. I made these patches back in like the early 90s on this synthesizer. I've tried to recreate them on the Phantom. I've tried to recreate them on the Rev4. I've tried to recreate them on multiple different synthesizers. And I've always fallen short of being able to recreate them. So on the Prophet 10, I was finally able to get pretty close. Again, 90%, 85% there. I can't say the difference is a result of the newer components inside of it. I think the difference is more because of the capabilities of each synthesizer. The Roland JX3P has different features, a few different features than the Prophet 5/10. That being said, even with those differences, I think I've gotten pretty close with a few of my favorite patches. So I'm going to play you those comparisons and let you hear how a modern vintage analog polyphonic synthesizer compares to a vintage polyphonic analog synthesizer. One thing I'd like to further note is that myself and a lot of my synthesizer friends, especially those of us that post videos on YouTube, here's one of our cardinal sins. We flip-flop all the time. Do not buy a synthesizer based on what anybody on YouTube tells you, including Nick from Sonic State, because we flip-flop. We are the most flip-floppy-ish fish in the sea. We will tell you we love one synthesizer 1 second, and then we will turn our backs against it and knock it down. You all know I love the Rev4. I've recently thought about selling it to get the new OBX, right? And then the next day I go, that's ridiculous. Why would I do that? And I haven't done it, and I'm saying right now that I won't. But that doesn't mean ultimately I won't, okay? What matters most about any synthesizer, in my humble opinion, is the sound and the music that you make with it. And that's why you'll stay invested in a synthesizer for years. Because there's a learning curve to each synthesizer. I've had the Rev4 for almost 4 years now, and I'm finally beginning to understand some of the possibilities that I haven't touched with it. Some days the Pro 3 is my favorite modern analog. Some days it's the Prophet 10. Other days it's the Rev4. There isn't a solid answer. But since I've had the luxury of buying multiple synthesizers over the last 4 years, I've also come to the conclusion that I've spent more time getting into the gear than I have getting into music composition. And that's not a good thing. I think those of us on the internet who are synthesizer enthusiasts should also maybe reprioritize our ambitions into making more music instead of lusting after gear.